Welcome back to The Bible's Art. We explore the literary artistry of the Bible, and this week we're talking about perhaps the most misunderstood person in the entire Bible, Samson. I'm still getting set up here in our new place, but I want to talk about Samson because he's a fascinating character. Now, I say he's the most misunderstood person because if you take a volume, a commentary on the book of Judges, just any sort of random commentary, most of the time, the judges in general, but Samson in particular, gets a bad rap, right? These judges are like bad guys. They're leading the people astray. And that's sort of the most common interpretation among commentators of Samson. Now, most of the time, not that it matters, but most of the time on books of the Bible and commentators, they're like, right about stuff, or I agree with them. But in this case, I think that that most of these commentators, a lot of what they say, or a chunk of it, is not exactly right. And so I'll mention some resources at the end of this video if you want to follow up, because this is not me. But let's get a framework for understanding Judges and Samson. So Samson has a relationship, I'm leaving that vague, a relationship with three Philistine women. In the middle of them is described as a prostitute. Now, to understand what's going on with Samson, and I've made another video on Samson before talking about the sort of riddle of Samson, and that's kind of the idea. He tells riddles, and Samson himself is a riddle. And we're going to see why that is in a second. But to understand him, we got to get some idea of what the book of Judges is about. Now, overall, we should feel good about the judges. And I say that for a couple of reasons. Reason number one is in the introduction to the book. There's actually two introductions in Judges. And in the introduction, we are told about what scholars call the cycle of the judges. So the judges rebel, turn after false God. God sells them into servitude to the nation to which whose gods they are whoring. And then the people cry out, and then God sends them a judge to save them. Now, our narrator is giving us the interpretive framework for the book. That is to say, hey, as you're going through this work, I want this structure to be in your mind. This is how you're supposed to interpret the book. Now, of course, sometimes you have setups, and then we have a sort of misdirection. Oh, we weren't expecting this, and our expectations are changed. Yes, that happens. But normally, most of the time, if the narrator gives us this sort of interpretive framework, then we should listen. This should be our sort of like normal disposition in the book. Now, that's the first thing. So the author of Judges gives us the sort of structure of Judges and how it's going to do. That God sends the judge to save the people. That's like the normal thing that happens. So when we're reading this, that's what we should be thinking of. Now, the second thing is in the book of Hebrews in the New Testament, where Samson is listed, among other judges like Gideon, as a man of faith. And so we should be able to, now that's not a sort of evaluation of every act of the character. New Testament authors obviously have nuance, and they can understand, and they can point on different parts, just like David is described after a man after God's own heart, and clearly he did. He was a sinful man, a very sinful man. But just like we should read the life of David and think, man, he has a heart for God, so we should read about Samson and say that was a man of faith. This is a man to be emulated for his faith in God. And I think that most of the time, if you read sort of like most of the commentaries, you read away, oh, this guy's a scoundrel, he's a horrible guy. Okay, so we have our narrator giving us sort of this interpretive framework. We've got the author of Hebrews telling us, but there's one other thing. Now, at the beginning of the Samson cycle, the Samson story, we have our narrator pop into the scene. Now, one important thing about biblical style is that it is very rare for a narrator to provide an evaluation or a perspective, because most of the time in narrative art, and narrative art of the Bible in particular, the evaluation, the perspective of the author is communicated implicitly, or as we all learned in English class growing up, show, don't tell. So the author shows us, and we're supposed to figure it out as a reader, and doesn't explicitly come out and tell us. Okay, that's part of the art of narrative, that we are invited into this thing, and we have to discover through narrative indications how the story is told, what words and what ways, what the causality, how does the author's actions cause other things, right? Through all of these means to arrive at the perspective, the evaluation of the writer. But every once in a while, the narrator in biblical stories will pop into the story and give us an authoritative perspective. And the authors normally do this. The main reason, I think, is so that we would be absolutely clear. That is to say, this perspective has narrative import. It's important to the story. Hey, it's really important that you, reader, get this into your mind as you're reading, because it's important to have this evaluative perspective when you read the story. Well, the second thing is sometimes the author will provide this because it would be easy to think the opposite, which is what is going on here in our story. This is something also the author of Genesis, the narrator in Genesis, does with the Jacob cycle. So in that sort of, I think it's the second scene after the birth, you have Jacob and Esau and him coming in and with the red stuff, the soup, right? And he gets it from his brother, right? I'm trying to use the words carefully, because often Jacob will be described as, oh, he stole it. But the fascinating thing is that a narrator comes in at the end of the story, provides this authoritative evaluation and says, and thus Esau despised his birthright. Right? So Esau is the primary problem, not Jacob, right? And it's the same thing in the Samson story. Our narrator comes in at the beginning of the story when Samson wants to get his first wife, his first bride. He said, I saw a woman down there, go get her for me, talking to his father. Now, of course, as good Israelite readers, we're assuming like, Samson, what are you doing? Can't you go to a faithful Israelite woman? It seems to be unwise. It's not disallowed, but it seems unwise. And then our narrator pops in, and our narrator tells us that this was from the Lord because God was, or it's actually an unclear subject there. And my guess is that it's both God and Samson. He was looking for a way to get the Philistines, to get justice for the Philistines. That is to say, our narrator pops in and provides this authoritative evaluation so that we would be clear that this is not wrong, what Samson is doing, right? And so we're going to see Samson and women throughout the story, but he said, it's not wrong. I know it might seem like he's being a womanizer or going over to the Philistines when he should be with Israelite woman, but that's not what's going on. So if this is our perspective going in, that we should have overall a good feeling about Samson as a faithful man, and chapter 1, then we should try to see if our narrator is crafting it in this way. Let me read to you one of these short stories, just a few verses of his relationship. I'm going to leave that vague, with this prostitute. This is in chapter 16, the first few verses. This is what it says. Samson went to Gaza, and there he saw a prostitute and went into her. The Gazites were told, Samson has come here, and they surrounded the place and set an ambush for him all night at the gate of the city. They kept quiet all night, saying, "Let us wait until the light of the morning, then we will kill him." But Samson lay till midnight. At midnight he rose and took the doors of the gate of the city and the two posts and pulled them up, bar and all, and put them on his shoulders and carried them to the top of the hill that is in front of Hebron. Okay, so this seems like a clear thing. Like, what's Samson doing? He's just like going to a prostitute or whatever. But I don't think so. And I think when we look really closely, we see some fascinating things. And once again, we got to go back to the first story in Judges, because that gives us an interpretive clue to what God is doing in the book of Judges. So in the book of Judges, in the first chapter, you have God is giving these remaining, in the book of Joshua, you had them take the major cities in Israel. But then there's still a lot of land left, and the book of Judges is dealing with the rest of those lands. So you start out the book of Judges in a sort of like paradigmatic, faithful Israelite way. They inquire of the Lord. They said, "Hey, who should go up and fight?" He says, "Judah." And then Judah calls his brother Benjamin. "Hey, come on with me. This is all great. We're working together." It's just like that. And then we get a story of the first conquest, the first fight story. And at first, when we're reading through this story, it seems kind of like this is like a paradigmatic conquering the land story. But there's a twist at the end. There's a twist that clues us into the particular way that God is going to be doing things in the book of Judges. So let me read this to you. This is Judges chapter 1 and verse 4. Then Judah went up, and the Lord gave the Canaanites and the Perizzites into their hand, and they defeated 10,000 of them at Bezek. They found Adonai-Bezek at Bezek and fought against him and defeated the Canaanites and the Perizzites. Adonai-Bezek fled, but they pursued him and caught him and cut off his thumbs and his big toes. Okay, so that's the first strange thing. At first, it was just like, hey, they were victorious. And then you're like, cut off his thumbs and his big toes? Like, what is it? It seems like unusually cruel, right? But then we read this. And Adonai-Bezek said, 70 kings with their thumbs and their big toes used to pick up scraps under my table. As I have done, so God has repaid me. So now we can see what's going on. Why did the author of Judges choose to put this story first? The author of Judges could have organized his material in different ways, but he wanted this to be first to clue us in. And you see, we realize here with that first speech of Adonai-Bezek that, no, this wasn't something that was like strangely cruel that the Israelites did. Even Israelites' enemy, Adonai-Bezek, realizes, no. This was a cruelty that I did to 70 people, right? I cut off their finger and toes, and I made them to be slaves under my table. And now that has come upon me. The very evil that I did has been reversed upon me. So God is using this evil that they did, and he's using that for justice back on them. There's this reversal, this contrapasso and Dantean terms, right? Okay, so maybe that'll help us understand Samson. You see, when Samson is described as going into a prostitute, that word prostitute, the first use of that root word, not the noun, but the verb form, is used with what Israel did with the foreign gods in the introductory chapters of Judges. Whoring, prostituting oneself, is what the Israelites do. And in keeping with this theme of God giving them the evil that they're doing, what Samson is doing the very thing that the people are doing. but he's doing it in a just way. You see, the same word of going into doesn't always mean to have sex with. It's used in non-sexual ways all the time. Furthermore, there's an allusion in this text because when is the last time we saw a prostitute and the breaking down of walls? Yes, it's at Jericho and Joshua in the beginning of the conquering of this land. So we see that what God is doing with Samson is he is doing the very thing that the Israelites doing, whoring after other gods, but he's doing it in a way to actually repay the justice of the Philistines. Samson is taking the very actions, the very imagery of Israel, going off to these foreign gods, but redeeming it, using it for justice, just like Adonai Bezek, and is cutting off thumbs and big toes and it coming back on his head. Now, Samson is not perfect. He has his faults. And his fault is when you come with the story of Samson and Delilah and the hair. His error, like Adam, is giving his strength to a woman, in the words of Paul, right? He gives up the secret of his strength, and then he is defeated. Well, what does that mean? What's the purpose of that for the readers? The secret of Samson's strength is something that is very small, his hair, just like the secret of our strength is our faith. But it seems small and fragile. Jericho's walls came down with walking and a marching band. What would happen if they didn't walk? What would happen if Abraham didn't walk to Canaan? Or you don't tell your son with your tongue that you love him. James says the tongue is a small thing, but it can do mighty things. So the secret of our strength is small, but it's powerful, and we ought not give it away. We need to use it well. So Samson is a man of faith. He's a man of riddles, and God uses him as an image to the Israelites for what they're doing, and he uses that image for justice. Samson goes to be with these other women, but not just to satiate his desires, but to redeem and to save Israel and to be a mirror of Israel for who they are. This is Samson, and this is his riddling faith. And that, my friends, is why the Bible is art. Thank you so much for checking out The Bible's Art this week. I really do appreciate it. If you'd like to support the channel, you can do so at patreon.com/thebibleisart. You can go to thebibleisart.com/ I think that's like a newsletter if you'd like to get notified whenever I post another video. If you have any questions, leave them below, and I will see you in the next